Hello, my name is Joel Lisonbee. I'm a Drought Information Coordinator at NIDIS. When it was determined that one of the objectives of this workshop was to share information on the state of current research on drought assessment and changing climate, we thought this would be a perfect time to do a literature review, and I volunteered. I began with a topical search in the Web of Science database for the terms drought and climate change, and as you can imagine, that produced over 26,000 results. I didn't even try. So we decided we really needed to narrow down our research questions, and the questions we came up with are these. There are two of them. First of all, the first one's around reference climatologies for drought assessment. Are there papers that support a 30-year climatology as being correct as opposed to using the full period of record? Are there other studies on specific popular indicators that provide a recommended reference period for assessing drought? And number two, within the literature, are there recommendations on changes in how we monitor and assess drought because of climate change? Now, I'd like to give you a quick indication about my method as I put together this review. I followed the Pickering and Barn 2014 method for literature reviews, which included a search for a few keywords within the Web of Science database. These keywords were these: drought assessment and climate change together. I also did an additional search with the combined terms of drought assessment and non-stationarity, and a third search for standardized precipitation index, or the SPI, and climate change. Now, that last one produced over 3,000 results, which should be an indication that this literature review is not going to be completely exhaustive, but it's going to give us an idea of where things are up to with the literature and how we got here. I refined those last results by adding the search term of drought assessment, and this reduced the final number to only 59 from that last search. We also asked workshop registrants to provide some recommendations of papers that should be included in the literature review. We received 85 suggestions, many of which made it into the final review. I also did a subsequent Google Scholar search for the terms drought plus reference period plus non-stationary climate. This provided 111 results, and a little over half of these Google Scholar results were irrelevant and were eliminated right away just by looking at the title of them. These included things like material science studies and structural engineering papers. I went to Google Scholar because it searches a little bit differently from Web of Science, where Web of Science looks at the title, abstract, and keywords. Google Scholar will look for any time these terms got mentioned anywhere within the text, which gives a little bit of a broader view of what papers could be included. Following all of those searches, I also came across about 20 other papers that were found in the references of other papers that I was looking at, so they were added to the review. Following these, any other duplicates were removed, and I finally landed on 359 papers that were considered in the final review, and these were assessed by title, abstract, and conclusion sections to see if they needed to be included or not. Throughout this whole process, I was really looking for a few specific things. One, did it answer the two research questions that we had? And two, I was specifically excluding papers that used drought indices as an evidence of climate change, but including papers that used climate change as a way to assess our drought indices. I hope that makes sense. Following all of this process, I landed on 71 papers that would be included in a final formal review. However, because of time, I'm not going to be mentioning all of them in this presentation today. And now let's jump into the results of this literature review. I'm going to need to go through this pretty fast and without much detail on individual papers or methods. The first use of the term climate normal was in a meteorological monograph in 1840 by Henrik Wilhelm Dove. The idea of defining a consistent temporal period to act as a standard for meteorological comparison also came up in an essay by Professor Biesballet in 1872. It's the same essay that promoted the formation of what is now the World Meteorological Organization, or WMO, an acronym that I'm going to be using quite a bit going forward. In 1935, the WMO instructed member nations that these normals should be 30 years in length and include the years of 1901 to 1930. Gutman 1989 gives some background as to why 30 years was chosen and some of the issues that arose right away from this decision. In 1956, the WMO updated the reference period to establish the idea on regular updates every 10 years. The introduction of climate indices specific to drought assessment is a little bit muddled. In 1957, a book about the history of drought in Australia used a cumulative precipitation anomaly to quantitatively assess drought. And this is probably the first documented case of using a precipitation index for the sole purpose of assessing drought. However, Palmer 1965 introduced what is now known as the Palmer Drought Severity Index, or PDSI, and both Palmer and at least one subsequent paper identified this 1965 paper as the first actual quantitative drought index. Both papers shown here use the full period of available records to calculate the drought. In addition to the PDSI in 1965, the same paper by Palmer also introduced us to the Palmer Hydrological Drought Index and the Palmer Moisture Anomaly Index, commonly known as the Z Index. Another less well-known drought index proposed in 1965 was the Rainfall Anomaly Index by Van Roy. In 1967, a paper by Gibbs et al. Introduced us to the use of rainfall deciles as drought indicators, a method that's still used operationally in Australia today. All of these indices presented so far use the full period of record. In 1968, Palmer gave us another drought index based on the PDSI. This one was specific to crops, and it again used the full period of record available at the time. The commonly used aridity index was introduced in 1979, more to assess which climates were considered arid and less for diagnosing the occasional lows in precipitation variability. Two new drought indices were introduced in 1980, but with specific hydrologic applications. Both used a full period of record, but could reasonably be calculated with a shorter reference period if needed. Another hydrologic drought index was introduced in 1982 that was similar to the PDSI, but for snowpack runoff. This was based on the full period of record, and this is just one example of how ingrained the use of PDSI had become in the early 1980s. By 1984, there arose some criticism of the PDSI and how it assessed drought. The first of these critiques came in 1984. Ali questioned some of the assumptions that were needed to calculate the PDSI and labeled the threshold set by Palmer as arbitrary. But Ali did not address non-stationarity in this critique. Carl, 1986, investigated the PDSI and wrote that the index is highly sensitive to the base period used to calculate it. In fact, quote, by changing the base periods used to calibrate the coefficients, the magnitude and sign of the PDSI changed significantly in many areas of the United States, close quote. As far as I can tell, this is the first time the stationarity assumption is challenged, although Carl didn't use these words. And it's also the first time that a shorter reference period is tested. Getting back to the timeline for drought indices, you'll see a minor shift in how I'll report this. The WMO Integrated Drought Management Program lists 50 common drought indices, but there are less common indices that aren't even mentioned in that handbook. Overall, there are easily over 100 drought indices, and it seems like more are proposed each year. So throughout the rest of this timeline, I can't go through all indices, but I'm going to focus either on a few very common indices that I think most of us are familiar with, or standardized indices, and also indices that provide a recommendation of what they call, quote, correct reference periods for drought assessment. Looking at what I'm showing here, papers in the mid-1980s often would use this terminology of normals. They would check against normals and they would include normals in the drought index calculation, but it wasn't often that they actually specified what that normal meant, whether that was a shorter contemporary climate period or the full period of record. The first paper to analyze how climate normals should be used comes from Gutman, 1989. Much of the history on climate normals that I've shared so far in this review come from this paper. Gutman noted that the use of a fixed climate normal period for climatological comparisons, quote, imply very little about climate change, non-random fluctuations, or extremes. They are simply an assessment of deviations from a reference. The Standardized Precipitation Index, or the SPI, was first introduced by McKee, Duskin, and Kleist in 1993. The SPI is really important to this conversation about non-stationarity, and I'll explain why. While the SPI was introduced in 1993, it very quickly became a very popular drought indicator. And because it's easy to calculate and it's relatively easy to understand if you think in standard deviations. Fast forward to 2009, at a workshop called the Interregional Workshop on Indices and Early Warning Systems for Drought, the SPI was recommended as the drought index to be used globally among national meteorological and hydrological services. This became known as the Lincoln Declaration, and it was published in a BAMS paper in 2011. While it provides recommendations on drought indices to use, it does not mention period of record or non-stationarity or climate change in these recommendations. A lot of the discussion around non-stationarity in the literature comes from papers that are assessing the standardized precipitation index. So now we're going to fall down this SPI rabbit hole. Beginning with the McKee et al. 1993 paper, we learned that the SPI is conceptually simply the precipitation anomaly divided by the standard deviation, where the mean and standard deviation are determined from past records. But it's not that simple. You see, precipitation doesn't fit a normal or Gaussian distribution. Partly because you can't have negative precipitation, and partly because small precipitation events are far more common than large ones, precipitation fits best when estimated against a gamma distribution. So to calculate the SPI, first you have to decide which time period to calculate the SPI for, 3, 6, 12, 24, or 48 months. Next, you need to fit the full data set to the gamma function to define the relationship of probability to precipitation. Then you need to translate the data from a gamma distribution to a normal distribution such that the mean is 0 and the standard deviation is 1. So knowing that the SPI needs to be translated to a normal distribution, how much data is needed to do that well? When McKee first proposed the SPI, it was recommended to use at least 30 years, but the more data, the better. Gutman in 1994 evaluated the statistics of a stable gamma distribution and showed that 60 to 70 years of data is ideal to estimate the tails of the distribution, and the smaller the sample size, the more unreliable the probabilities in the cumulative probability function becomes. In 2005, Wu et al. Also tested the statistics of the skewness and kurtosis of the gamma distribution and confirmed that when it comes to data, the more the merrier. However, they also acknowledge almost as an afterthought in the conclusion section that these results assume a stationary climate, and where the climate is changing, a shorter record may be better. 2013, the WMO released an SPI user guide. It quoted Gutman in 1994 to say that at least 20 to 30 years is needed, but a 50 to 60 years of data is optimal when calculating the SPI. In fact, if using a 24-month or greater SPI, then a record of 80 to 100 years is needed to provide statistical confidence that the probability estimate on the tails of the distribution are representative. Around the time of the WMO report, there was not consistency in the length of record used to calculate the SPI. Some studies used a full record, while others used a 30-year reference period, and others still used something different altogether, although this was usually justified in their methods. Stagg et al. 2017 recommended the use of a 30-year reference period. Carbone 2018 recommended a reference period that exceeded 60 years. Et al. 2016 divided the full record into 30-year chunks to calculate the SPI. They showed that the choice of reference period can make a big difference in the SPI values, and a longer record can actually mask actual precipitation deficits. Their recommendation was to use a shorter reference period that is regularly updated. From the small subset of papers examined in this literature review, the SPI was calculated using a full period of record 13 times, and a 30-year SPI was used 9 times. The push for shorter reference periods and alternative approaches to calculating the SPI began about a decade ago. Stepping away from the SPI, but now considering other drought indices, following the SPI, there was a rise in standardized drought indices. These are usually indices that divide the mean by a standard deviation to provide indices that can be compared with each other or with themselves over space and time, with caveats, of course. Some of these include the Standard Runoff Index from Schulk and Wood, 2008, the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index by Vicente Serrano et al., 2010, and the Standardized Soil Moisture Index, which was published in 2014. All of these standardized indices assume a stationary climate. So the question still remains, are there recommendations on changes of how we monitor or assess drought because of climate change? Well, many papers have pointed to stationarity assumption as a problem. Probably the first of these was Metalis 1997, who questioned the hydrologic flood model in a changing climate. The concept of climate change was relatively new in 1997, and you get that sense when you're reading this paper. But Metellus was definitely ahead of his time in speculating that increased temperatures will probably create hydrologic trends. In 2009, two papers proposed alternatives to the way we calculate the SPI to acknowledge non-stationarity in long-term climate. Villarini et al. 2010 applied the generalized additive model in location and shape, or the Gamel's approach, to model rainfall and temperature where trends were known but assumed to change. The Gamel's model approach will get applied to this problem by a lot of subsequent papers. Russo et al. 2013 took a deep dive into the stationarity SPI problem and developed a non-stationary SPI that will be applied by subsequent papers. Unlike the two papers in 2009, the Russo et al. Paper was the first to apply a non-stationary approach to the gamma distribution. Following Russo et al. 2013, 6 additional papers followed a similar approach to tackle the drought non-stationarity problem, but in a slightly different way from what Russo did. For the sake of time, I can't go into the details of these, but just know that these are out there. Developed methodologies less so for drought indices and more so for drought risk analysis, or the analysis of extreme climate events, such as constructing precipitation, intensity, duration, frequency curves in the non-stationary context. Anyutha 2017 introduced a non-stationary frequency analysis of extreme events. Cancillary 2017 pursued a non-stationary framework to quantify return periods of drought and drought risk. This paper in 2018 used a full period of record to calculate a non-stationary reconnaissance drought index. Zhou et al. 2018 produced a non-stationary streamflow index using the Gamel's algorithm. Zhang et al. 2019 used a parameter transplantation method to quantify the impacts of climate change on drought. Rashid and Beecham 2019 calculated a non-stationary SPI by considering large-scale climate variability to be sources of non-stationarity in addition to climate change. Park et al. 2019 proposed another new SPI method that considers the existing probability distribution and the return period. Das et al. 2019 developed a new non-stationarity-based SPI drought index using the Gamel's method. Xiao et al. 2020 compared stationary and non-stationary approaches to the SPI calculation. And Song et al. 2020 created a non-stationary SPI following the Russo et al. 2013 method. Das et al. 2021 developed a non-stationary meteorological drought index incorporating large-scale climate oscillations as covariates in the gamma and log normal distributions. J. Hanzabe et al. 2021 also used the Gamel's method to address non-stationarity and showed that time series in excess of 30 years can introduce errors into the statistics. Zhang et al. 2021 proposed a non-stationary meteorological and hydrological drought index. Wang et al. 2022 proposes a new non-stationary standardized runoff index. And the final paper that mentions how they accounted for non-stationarity is Blaine et al. 2022, who introduced a non-stationary gamma distribution into the SPI calculation. Before I conclude, I wanted to share a few other quick gems that I found as I was going through this literature. Kamalri et al. 2022 is critical of current non-stationary SPI approaches, citing that these methods are too complex to ever be applied operationally. They further find that when using a 30-year window, an update frequency of 10 years may not be enough to keep pace with climate change, and they recommend an update cycle of every 5 years. We've already heard from Zach Quillman today, but this well-written paper demonstrates that reference period matters a lot in the SPI calculation, and longer climatology lengths will introduce more error in the statistics and overall frequency of drought when compared with a more contemporary climate. The sweet spot of climatology length can be different for each measurement location and region of the country. This one may be my favorite paper I came across in this review. Sato et al. 2021 articulated what they and the IPCC call the drought definition problem. Basically, at high latitudes, the severity and frequency of drought that is assessed depends just as much on how you define the drought in other words, which index and reference period is used, as it does on anything else. In these regions, the definition used was the dominant source of uncertainty in drought assessment. The final gem I'm going to share with you today comes from Stevenson et al. 2022. This paper is fantastic about framing the whole issue and why non-stationarity in the climate makes drought assessment hard and creates problems when making drought projections. I'm going to put the link to this paper into the chat box, and I encourage all of you to give it a read. Share some of the overall conclusions of this literature review. What are the recommended periods of record for drought assessment? The WMO had been recommending a 30-year reference period since 1935. But that wasn't really applied to drought assessments, where it was understood that the more data was better. Before 1997, approximately when climate change was beginning to become more mainstream, there was a push to use as much data as possible for drought assessments. As errors due to non-stationarity assumptions became apparent, there's been a push over the last decade to use shorter reference periods, with 30 years being the most commonly used. Are there recommendations on changes of how we monitor and assess drought because of climate change? There have been at least 18 non-stationary drought indices proposed over the last several years. Recent papers have recommended using shorter reference periods with more rapid data updates for drought assessments to be representative of a contemporary climate. And finally, these are the references that I used just in this presentation. I'll make these references available to the workshop attendees in the coming weeks.